Let's focus on energy now. A report by the World Bank and the Off-Grid Solar Industry Group is arguing that at current trends, the world will still have 660 million people without access to any kind of electricity on or off the grid by 2030. Now, this report points out that 2 decades of progress, in fact, was reversed in 2022, when the number of persons without access to power went up to 685 million. But their estimates, in fact, $3.6 billion needs to be spent each year between now and 2030 to deliver electricity access to at least 400 million people for whom off-grid solar would probably be the most efficient solution. But that figure is 6 times the amount invested in the sector so far, and access to capital, particularly in local currencies, is still quite challenging. Now, in 2023, about 40% of these off-grid solar power kits, and that includes panels, lights, related accessories, they're essentially all bought on credit, essentially on a pay-as-you-go plan. Compare that, however, to 24% in 2018. By industry estimates, though, just 1 in 5 households lacking power can afford these monthly payments, and rising prices, which went up by nearly 60%, are putting more and more households in the dark. A little earlier, I explored why this affordability problem is growing and the potential solutions to it with Patrick Tanui. He's the head of policy and regional strategy at the Global Association for the Off-Grid Solar Industry.
Today, purely due to essentially the levels of poverty and the lack of income by the communities and the households today that don't have energy access, only 22% of them can afford the full cost of a tier 1 solar product. That means 78% purely because of where they live, and also essentially their income levels cannot afford a product. So this is, as we've made progress and we look at the last decade, our industry has been able to bring energy access to about over 500 million people, 100 million households. Those that are left today are still those that live in the hardest to reach places. They may be displaced, or really these are the very poorest amongst us. So it's these communities and these people and these households that, despite everything we are doing to bring down the cost, if you don't have a steady source of income, if you're making a choice between do I buy an energy product or put food on the table, they don't have that flexibility and the ability. And it's these people that we're really saying are going to be left behind. It's really today where we are, it's over about 300 million people will need some type of subsidy to be able to get an energy access product, or they live in places that are just too hard to reach.
When we say that, there's an affordability issue, are we talking about affordability in the sense that the product itself, let's exclude the financing costs for a moment, because a lot of these assets are essentially bought on a pay-as-you-go model. Is it that the asset itself is unaffordable pre-financing, or is it unaffordable even if you try and get the lowest possible cost of financing?
I think it's actually a mix between both, but I want to add one thing before I respond to your question. We are also looking at this issue of making sure that we get quality products. If you wanted to just get the cheapest product out there, you could get it at a significantly lower cost. However, today, when we look at a quality verified product, which means it needs to be able to perform and have warranty, which means if it fails, it should be replaced within the warranty period, which is typically 2 years for and higher for different components. So if we're looking to do that, today a tier 1 product in an urban center will probably be about $127 cost. And this is in the report. But to bring that same product to a rural community, and you look at countries like DRC, where even transport across the country is challenging, it goes up to $200. When you take that product and even you try to finance it and you offer flexible payment terms, and then you look at the ability to pay of the households, it still costs too much, and therefore the numbers don't make sense.
So the figure that the report has is $3.5 billion a year that essentially is needed to try and close that access gap across the markets that you're talking about. Exactly. in West Africa, East Africa, parts of Asia as well. But 40% of that number, you say, has to come in from subsidies. What sorts of subsidies are we talking about here? Are we talking about specific tax breaks from governments in these particular areas? Walk us through the policy models that you have in mind.
So I think that 40% comes in different forms of subsidies. We've got what we call end user subsidies, which is a direct subsidy to the consumer or the household to lower the cost of the product, right? So that's one end of subsidies. I think if we look at particularly what's been done on electrification throughout, nobody today pays what you call cost reflective tariff. To get a grid connection is on average about $1,200 to $1,500 to get a grid connection. If you're in a country like Kenya today, you may pay 35,000 shillings or $350, not the true cost. And essentially, electrification has always been subsidized because that cost to electrify is not affordable. So the public comes in and lowers that cost to make sure that everybody's connected. So the first is end user subsidies to directly lower the cost. On taxes, this is the second component. In most countries, if you look at both the value-added tax as the import duties, it'll add up to between 35 to 45% of your price that the consumer pays. So if we take that tax, that VAT or the import duties off, it's also bringing down the cost to the consumer, which is another form of subsidy or price support to improve the affordability.